I'm going to put him in B tier because I think that a lot of the extended part of Final Fantasy VII has kind of missed the point. Final Fantasy's gallery of villains are, much like the hero, some of the best and most iconic that video games have to offer, but as is always the case, they are not all made equal, and so let's dive into each of the villains from the primary numbered titles and place them in a tier list of their own. Plus, we're adding a new feature to these videos that allows you to have your own voice heard, so stay tuned to the end to find out more. We've done the protagonists, now it's time for the antagonists, and I'm pretty sure that people are going to heavily debate some of the choices I make on this list, but hey, that's part of the fun, right? As with the protagonist tier list, I've predominantly gone with the numbered titles only, as otherwise this video will end up being 3 hours long, though I encourage you to add villains of your own in or sound off on your favourite villains outside of this list, like Caius from FF13-2 for example. I've also gone with the villains Square Enix tends to present as the primary antagonist of their respective games, except for one exception because it would be straight up criminal not to put them on this list, but that's why you see Jecht here as the rep for Final Fantasy X, not Seymour. And yes, Sephiroth is on this list twice, I will explain that when we get to him. And as will always be the case with any tier list I make on this channel, the objective of them is to create conversation and discussion on a shared subject that we love, and finding our tribe, so to speak, finding people who share our values and what makes us tick when it comes to characters, games, and otherwise. So we may not agree on the outcome of this list. In fact, I encourage you to disagree with me and let me know how you would create this tier list. I'll leave a link in the description box so you can make your own, but keep it cute and keep it classy. We don't want any full-blown fights out here. With a list like this, it's all purely subjective, and we want to create conversation but make it respectful. And with that, let's just get on with it. So where best to start then at the very beginning, and we're going to start with Final Fantasy I's Garland. Now, I don't know about you, but despite the fact that I ranked Warrior of Light as highly as I did in the protagonist tier list, I feel that despite the fact that Garland is the first antagonist that Final Fantasy's had, he doesn't quite carry the same weight that Warrior of Light does design-wise or iconography-wise. It's even stranger saying that when you consider that Garland actually got his own video game in Stranger of Paradise, but I feel that that video game didn't really cement Garland's role as a villain. If anything, it just kind of diluted him a little bit and made it so that he was a misunderstood character, which I feel is almost like the Disneyfication of a villain nowadays. However, that being said, Garland is actually one of the few villains in Final Fantasy that is successful in what he sets out to do. With the chaos loop, time loop situation that Garland puts himself in, he does actually get away with what he's trying to do. The time loop is successful, and one can argue he's the only villain on this list that actually fully succeeds in what he does, because there's no way of knowing at the end of Final Fantasy I if the time loop has actually ended or not. In terms of a tier list though, like when you pit him against a lot of the other villains that are on this list, ones that are much more fleshed out, ones that are much more recognizable, ones that have a lot more going for them, even in combat, etc. Garland is pretty mid, if you ask me. I wouldn't say he was a flop, but I'd say he sits neatly in the B tier area. Like, I don't think he's bad, and I think he's better than a couple of the villains that follow him, but he doesn't carry the same weight as the hero that comes from the same game as him. Looking back at Stranger of Paradise, our next villain made a guest appearance in that in the DLC, which is the Emperor from Final Fantasy II. Let me get one thing straight. I love the way the Emperor looks, like the way that the Amano design from Dissidia kind of fleshed itself out. He looks fantastic, and I'd love to cosplay the character one day, and the David Bowie from Labyrinth realness is very real. But that's kind of as far as his character goes. In Final Fantasy II, he's a megalomaniac that just wants to take over the world, and without Soul of Rebirth, you don't really see him succeed at that either. You fight him once, then you fight him as the Hell Emperor, and then if you've got Soul of Rebirth, you fight him as the Heaven Emperor, which makes him as a very interesting final boss, but as an outright villain, I don't think he's got a lot of depth or really anything noteworthy about him. And so because of that, I think it's fairly safe to say that he's in the basic tier. I wouldn't put him in like D tier, flop, Tina, none of that, because there are aspects of the Emperor, which include his design, that I do think make him stand out a little more than a couple of the villains on this list. Spoilers, one of which is coming up next. But I don't think he really even begins to compare to the majority of the characters that we're about to present. So Final Fantasy III's representation of a villain is the Cloud of Darkness, and the problem that Cloud of Darkness has is that she's not really a character, or they're not really a character. They're just a representation of a force of nature, and that's pretty much it. Had the representation for Final Fantasy III's villain been Xander, I feel like there would have been a few extra points on this list. There is at least a little bit of backstory to Xander, where Cloud of Darkness really is just a bit of a Deus Ex Machina just popped up at the end of the game. It would be like putting Necron as the villain representation of Final Fantasy IX rather than Kuja. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so, because of that, flop Tina. Like, I'm sorry, Cloud of Darkness, you look cool, you know, boobalicious, doing all of the things you need to do, and they're pretty cool to play in the side games like Dissidia, etc., but as a villain, they're just a bit of a nothing burger. Much like with the heroes, Final Fantasy IV is where the characters really started to gain fleshed out stories, and that's very much true of Final Fantasy IV's Golbez. However, the thing you have to remember with Golbez is that he's actually pretty ineffectual at the things that he does. He himself is being mind controlled, and the only thing he really accomplishes within the story of Final Fantasy IV is mind controlling Kain and making him do all of his work for him. So I understand that he's trying to be kind of the force behind the curtain, but the fact that he actually isn't the force behind the curtain and that mantle belongs to Zemus and Zeramus means he's just kind of there. But he looks cool at least, and the Shadow Dragon's really cool. He gets redeemed a little bit in some of the outside stories like the After Years, etc. But again, the problem comes with Golbez is that he shares an identical story arc with Kain. Like, oh, woe is me, I was mind controlled. I feel bad about the things that I did under somebody else's influence and I want to sort of repent for those things. The fact that you've got two characters with identical story arcs, kinda weird. I will, however, give props to Golbez for having a much more fleshed out story than the Emperor or Cloud of Darkness, and to some extent even Garland. But I'll be honest, even in Final Fantasy XIV, I'm pretty sure most people think of him as a bit of a mid-villain. He was just trying to do the same thing over and over again, and I just don't think it translated very well to that particular game. But I'd love to know if you really loved the patch content for Endwalker. I kind of bounced off it, but that's irrelevant to FF4 Golbez. I'm just going off on a tangent, to be honest. So I'm quite happy to put him in B tier. I feel like some people might put him a bit higher, but I think I'm quite happy to put him there. Final Fantasy V is one of my favourite games in the franchise, and let's be real, the villain is not the reason why. Exdeath is kinda just there. Much like with Cloud of Darkness, Exdeath is presented more as a force of nature than an actual characterization, and I think that FF5's story suffers from that to a certain extent. However, one does have to remember that Exdeath did accomplish something that had not been done in a Final Fantasy game up until that point. He successfully dispatched one of the party member characters. You know, Galoof was feeling it by the end of the game. But realistically, there's not really a lot to talk about with Exdeath. He's not got much of a characterization. His interaction with the party is moo-ha-ha, I'm going to take over the worlds and merge them and unleash the void and send various minions at you. It's very kind of basic, but I would actually go so far as to... Would I put him as a flop? No, I think I'm going to stick him in the same tier as Emperor, because at least he is present in the game for the majority of it, and he does successfully get rid of Galoof, and there are interactions he has, like with Guido the Turtle, that are at least amusing, and the fact that Exdeath is a tree being a meme is quite funny is at least something in his merit, but yeah, he's definitely not higher than C. Now we're starting to get somewhere with these villains. So with Final Fantasy VI, you have arguably my favourite villain of all time, not just in Final Fantasy, and it's Kefka. There are many different reasons that people love Kefka within the Final Fantasy fandom, and I think that there's a bit of a misnomer where people say, oh, Kefka was the only villain that won. He actually isn't. Quite a few of the villains on this list do, actually, at least to the extent that Kefka does, but no one quite had the same amount of impact that he did when he did win. I also think that it's really interesting that a lot of people like to look at a character's motivations as to why they are the way they are. People want to relate to a villain, people want to be able to identify why someone acts the way they do. And that's kind of the reason I love Kefka as much as I do. Because you can't. He's crazy. He's insane. That's the entire point of it. As a slight tangent, one of my favourite stories, not from video games, but my favourite stories of all time is Alice in Wonderland. The reason for that is because you cannot explain most of what happens in Alice in Wonderland. It's all about the spectacle of it all. It's all about just the nonsense of it all. We don't have to explain everything. People have spent their entire lives trying to identify things like, why is a raven like a writing desk? Because people have to explain the unexplainable. And motivations like Kefka's fit into that mold really nicely, because you can sit there and analyze him all you want, but you're not going to get very far. Regardless of how many other villains on this list have won in their respective ways, no one really felt the impact of how they had at that time of Final Fantasy VI's release. Kefka taking the Warring Triad, making it so that the world was never the same again, wreaking that much destruction was something that people just never expected to see in a video game of that period of time. So the fact that it has a lasting impact to the point where people think that Kefka is the only character that won, even though he wasn't, goes to show quite how much of an impact that really had. I adore everything about Kefka, from his design to his motivations or lack thereof, to his lack of an origin story. He doesn't need any of it. And I'll be honest with you, I don't love the way that Kefka is presented outside of Final Fantasy VI, because I feel that they rely too heavily on the silly aspect rather than the sinister one. Like, this is the same guy that poisoned the water supply in Doma, and everyone kind of felt the lasting effects of it. But people don't tend to focus on that. They tend to focus on, I'm going to slap my backside and just talk nonsense and rubbish for a while. And I do think that that is a part of his character, but I think it's too heavily lent into. That being said, within the original Final Fantasy VI, and even beyond it, I think he's our first S-tier character. Okay, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm genuinely nervous about this one. Where does one even begin when it comes to Final Fantasy VII's Sephiroth? As far at least as Final Fantasy VII, the PlayStation 1 original, is concerned, Sephiroth is practically perfect as a character design. He's interesting, he's enigmatic, he's got such an iconic design that still carries over to this day. There's not a lot that one can really dislike about him. However, I'm actually going to start my section on Sephiroth by putting the tier list together, because I actually have him twice on this list, and I'll explain why. Final Fantasy VII, OG, as he was, no problems asked, S-tier character. No questions asked. He's, like I said, he's got all of the qualities that make him the icon he is today. He has spectacle with his final boss fights. He's interesting and enigmatic. You don't know a lot about it, but his presence is felt wherever you go. Then the remakes and everything outside of Final Fantasy started to happen, and I feel like while Sephiroth still has that level of iconography and people still love him, I'm going to put him in B tier, because I think that a lot of the extended part of Final Fantasy VII has kind of missed the point on what Sephiroth is and why he's the icon he is. Now, I'm going to use an example here to preface my point. I want you to take the original Midgar Zolom or Midgar Summer scene from the original Final Fantasy VII. You don't ever see Sephiroth during this scene. You just see the aftermath of what he's done, and yet you still feel his presence. And then I want you to take that exact same scene as seen in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the scene in which you do see how this all goes down and how Sephiroth takes out the Midgar. It's a lot less memorable. It just doesn't have that same impact as it did when you didn't see him actually perform the action. And this is an example, one of many, as to why I feel that Sephiroth had a lot more impact in Final Fantasy VII than he does in any game after it. I feel he's diluted. I feel he's over-explained. His backstory is unnecessarily over-elaborated on, and I feel we just see too much of him. If anything, I liken Sephiroth, in Final Fantasy VII at least, to the alien, the titular alien from the Alien movies. That character of the Xenomorph is at its most powerful when you don't see it. In fact, you almost never see it throughout the entire film, but you know it's there. You know its presence is there. And I feel the same way about Sephiroth. In Final Fantasy VII, you see very little of that character. You just hear whispers on the wind about the things that he's done, and you've got this image in your head about who Sephiroth is and why he's so strong and how he's able to just go through the entire world of Final Fantasy VII doing what he's doing. And yet every new release after Final Fantasy VII, and this includes Crisis Core, because I think it started on a very slippery slope with that, we've seen too much of him. And even with Remake, the first part of Remake, the fact that you see him within the first 5 minutes dilutes his character to me. And that's why I've put him on 2 separate tiers, because I think that he is S tier to begin with, but that character's getting watered down more and more over time. I am, of course, very open to the idea that part 3 is going to blow it wide open and I'll put him straight back up to S tier again. But right now, I feel the way I do. Interestingly, Ultimisia from Final Fantasy VIII suffers the opposite problem, where she kind of feels like she comes out of nowhere, even though she's actually very present for the majority of the game. The only problem with that is that you don't really know about it until maybe Disc 3, after your second fight with Idea. You have no idea who Ultimisia is up until that point, and she's kind of name dropped out of nowhere. And even then, you don't ever actually see the character Ultimisia until right at the end of the game. Until then, we've been built up with a completely different character who isn't a completely different character, but is possessed by Ultimisia in Idea. And Idea's design and iconography is so much more impactful than what Ultimisia's ends up being. Ultimisia from a design perspective is actually pretty cool, and it's really nice that we see a female antagonist within Final Fantasy, because those are extremely few and far between. But I feel like Ultimisia's kind of been reduced to a bit of a joke. When you look at, say, Dissidia or any of the side games, the most common thing you ever see about Ultimisia is the fact that she has an arguing match or rhyming match against Shantotto, which is kind of just a bit of a joke in and of itself, because Ultimisia isn't really explored very much in Final Fantasy VIII. You have to go looking elsewhere to find it. I don't think Ultimisia is a bad character by any means. As a matter of fact, if you explore Final Fantasy VIII and you really look into Ultimisia's kind of backstory and things like that, and I'm not talking about the crazy fan theories that Ultimisia is Rinoa or any of that rubbish, don't care about any of that. But within the confines of the game itself, there's a lot to explore with Ultimisia. I just don't feel that she's explored all that well, considering how little we see of her, at least within her own skin. But I'm happy to put her in B tier. I don't think she's like icon, like a lot of the characters that I'm going to talk about as time goes on, but I think she's very strong. Like, she's definitely on par with what I would say Remake Sephiroth is. Icon, there's iconography there, but I wouldn't call her an icon. Now, this is where my horrendous bias comes in, because other than Kefka, my favorite villain on this entire list is Kuja. So to anyone who says that Kefka is the only villain that wins, they clearly haven't met Kuja. Kuja successfully destroys the world twice, once on Terra, and then once again when he destroys the crystal for all life. But the only reason that that doesn't go through is that it ends up getting reversed through Necron and all of that stuff. But that's not much different from what happened with Kefka. Like, Terra's still gone. Like, when you finish that game, like, it doesn't come back. But the reason that I love Kuja as much as I do actually has nothing to do with his power level or any of that rubbish about the fact that he does win or any of that stuff. I find Kuja to be the most relatable villain in the list, or certainly one of them. Obviously, there's one later on that has a very similar kind of thing. But Kuja is afraid of dying, and he's afraid of being forgotten, and he's afraid to fight back against the destiny that he's had thrust upon him, but he doesn't want to, like, he lashes out. He has more of a foil, I would say, with Vivi than he does with Zidane, because both of them have a very similar trajectory in that they both know that they're expendable characters in terms of their lifespan, but where Kuja lashes out and, like, doesn't want to accept it, can't deal with it, and so goes on this rampage. And don't get me wrong, still a villain, still very manipulative, still like pulling the strings behind the scenes with Queen Bran and all of that. But his motivations are very human in nature, and it shows immaturity that a lot of real people would probably have, whereas Vivi, despite being a child, shows a lot of maturity in that situation and accepts what's going on with him. And so I feel that that dichotomy of those two against each other to be an extremely dynamic and appealing sort of lore binding. So I don't necessarily think that other people would put Kuja in the tier that I'm putting him in, but I'm putting him there because he genuinely is one of my favorite villains of all time, because while he is definitely a villain, I find him to be very, very relatable, and at least in his motives, and him trying to defy his own fate and wanting not to have his life railroaded for him. And he has that perfect foil in VV. I love his design, both his regular form and his transform. Him trying to hide himself, like he hides his tail because he doesn't want people to know who he really is. There's a lot that I find in Kuja that I can see as a reflection of negative impact on your surroundings, and I guess for that reason I find a lot of relatability in him. So I'd be curious to see if other people feel the same way with Kuja, and that's why I've put him in S tier. Final Fantasy X's villain role is challenging, to say the least, because technically there's two of them, but the villain that Square Enix likes to put front and center when it comes to FF10 is Jecht rather than Seymour. I think the reason that people kind of rebel against the idea of Jecht being the primary antagonist of Final Fantasy X rather than Seymour is because Jecht isn't a villain in so many words. I don't think he's a particularly nice guy. I mean, I would argue there's some level of abuse that comes from him towards Tidus, and it's not the best dynamic between a father and son, if you ask me. But he doesn't have that kind of mustache twirling vibe that Seymour has. And honestly, like, I understand Seymour's like motivations and stuff. Like, he has grown up around nothing. Like, he sees nihilism as the only way out due to what happened with his mother and the fact that he was stuck in Bard Temple for as long as he was. And so he now has this nihilistic trait where he sees death as a blessing and as a release. And I think that that's a really interesting string to pull on, or a bit of yarn to tug on, but I feel like ultimately it just ends up with Seymour being annoying more than it does him being like an actual overarching villain, because he just keeps coming back and doing the same thing over and over again. Whereas with Jecht, you have that dynamic between him and Tidus, but he's also not inherently evil. He's just put in a situation and wants to be released. Ironic when you consider his dichotomy against somebody like Seymour. I find it interesting that in the side games outside of Final Fantasy X, much like Kuja actually, Jecht is often painted as a misunderstood hero, which I actually understand in Jecht's case far more than I do with Kuja anyway, because Jecht is generally a kind of a nice guy. Like, he is there to kind of support the role, and he actually invites the player party in Final Fantasy X to defeat him because he knows that his role is played out and that he failed in his mission, and he serves as a reminder to the player party of what can happen if the same trends are like fulfilled over and over again. If you've like fulfilled Yevon's wishes, this is what will happen, and I want you to end it. So it's quite interesting to have a villain, I mean, I'll call him an antagonist because I feel it's a better word for him, as Sin, that just fits his role much, much better. And so having a villain that is, for the majority of the game, sympathetic outside of how he treated Tidus as a kid, I actually think that Jecht's kind of an icon. Like, if it were Seymour, I'd probably put him in B tier because, as I say, I understand his motivations. He's got a more sort of outlandish design like you would see from a Final Fantasy villain typically, but I think Jecht is kind of a win. I really like the way that he's presented. I like that he's remorseful for his actions, and his role as a villain is predominantly sad rather than angry or revenge-filled or anything like that, and I think it's a unique take, and I really like that. Now, I will be the first to confess that I am not the most well-versed in Final Fantasy XI, but I find it odd that the villain that Square Enix chooses to put forward for Final Fantasy XI for a lot of its side projects, whether it be the mobile games or Dissidia or anything like that, is Camlanaut, because I feel there are far more interesting villains in that game than him. I think that Camlanaut's role as the Archduke of Juno is interesting, to say the least, and he does serve as from a design perspective at the very least, as a more interesting warrior-esque villain than, say, Eldnash, his older brother, who I'd consider to be a far more interesting character than him. Eldnash was the one that came into contact with the Mother Crystals, was the one that had his life expectancy extended beyond belief. But even beyond those two, you have characters like Pramathia, who are much more intriguing characters from this rise to glory perspective, and the Shadow Lord. But I don't think that Final Fantasy XI's strong suit is its villains. I think it's the world in which they are situated that makes them who they are, as opposed to something like Final Fantasy XIV. So yeah, as I say, I don't know the finest details of Final Fantasy XI's deep lore, so I would love to hear from people who know it better than I do. But I just think that Final Fantasy XI has a much wider array of a rogues gallery than just Camlanor, and I feel that, especially because Camlanor is basically a minion to his brother, he's the wrong choice as the representative, but I don't know if he's a bad choice. Like, I put Ishtola and Shantotto as D tier choices in the protagonist list because I just felt they were completely wrong. But Camlanor at least does have screen presence as a villain, and he is presented as such. So I've put him in B tier, but I would like to hear from people who've played Final Fantasy XI for many, many years as to how they feel about Camlanor, because I am not super confident in my placement of him here. Now, here is a particularly interesting villain in Final Fantasy XII's Vayne. Now, I don't know if everyone is going to agree with me on this one, but I actually think that Vayne is one of the stronger villains in the franchise. I think possibly more than any other character on this list, Vayne is what you would call misguided rather than inherently evil. He's not a good guy by any stretch of the word. None of these guys are what you'd call heroes by any means, but Vayne is led by Venar, one of the Ikuria, who is himself trying to rebel against the Ikuria because the Ikuria are the ones that have all of the power in Ivalice, and Venar is trying to give Prometheus's fire back to humanity as such and sees Vayne as their conduit to do so. So in his own way, Vayne is actually trying to save humanity and is willing to bear the mantle of villain in order to do so, because he wants to give the power back to the people and take it away from the gods that are the Ikuria. Unfortunately for Vayne, the way in which he does so is pretty villainous. Like, he murders his father and pretty much like subjects the rest of the realm to just very bad situations, and he doesn't employ the greatest of people to do it, like Dr. Sid, who is a crazed scientist. But I think that misguided is the word that I would use to describe Vayne. And when you look deeper as to why he is the way he is and who he is, you see that he may not have the best way of doing things, but he does have good intentions. He also just ticks a lot of the boxes in ways that I just enjoy villains. He's intelligent, he's politically driven, he's charismatic, he's just very good at being an antagonist. And while I kind of I don't defend his actions because I think he's a terrible human being, but I just quite enjoy looking into the scratching beneath the surface of why he does what he does, because there is a lot there to be gleaned from information that's still within Final Fantasy XII. And I appreciate his iconography for that. I'm going to be real with you, and I'm going to skip 13's main villain because Daisley or Bartandler, etc. is a flop. Orphan is a flop. There's no charisma, there's no presence with Daisley whatsoever. The fact that Jilna Bart got more screen time than he did, I think, is very telling. 13's villains roster as a whole is very strange. Like, Sid Raines is kind of weird, also not a villain, kind of more engaging than Daisley is. The fact that the representation for 13's primary villain, as far as like other products are concerned, actually doesn't come from 13 but comes from 13 too in Caius, I think is very telling for 13's villainy. If Caius were who I was putting on this list, I'd probably put him at B, probably A, actually. I do think that Caius is really strong, but he's not on this list because I'm talking about FF13 and Caius ain't in it, and unfortunately, Bartandalus is a flop. And now for another contentious villain, certainly amongst the FF14 fan base, because now we're going to be talking about Xenos. So Xenos is very one-track minded, and I think that puts a lot of people off, certainly when compared with another certain villain within Final Fantasy XIV. But I actually kind of like him. I think it's okay to have a simpler villain, and not everyone has to have their motivations, etc., and everything explained. Much like Kefka. I liken Xenos to Kefka in a lot of ways. I don't think he quite carries the same weight as Kefka does, but he definitely has a lot of presence whenever he is on the screen. He's very charismatic, he's very stoic, and he has a singular goal, and he's very consistent with the way that he is throughout multiple expansions, whether you're looking at him in Stormblood or Endwalker or even beyond those two. He's at least consistent in what he's doing. The way I like to look at Xenos is that his motivations are you. All of the other villains in Final Fantasy XIV, who honestly there's enough of them that I could make a tier list just on FF14 antagonists alone, Actually, sound off in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. They have their own agendas, and the Warrior of Light's objective are to stop their plans. Well, in Xenos' case, you are his reason to fight, and the strange relationship that he has with you is certainly unique. Much like Kefka, you can't really explain why he acts the way he does, which is what makes him scary. There's a level of insanity to Xenos that can't be met on the same wavelength. He holds up a mirror to the character as if to almost say, you caused this, presenting a very dicey set of connotations, and I think that makes him an imposing character. Possibly not the best one ever written, but certainly better than a lot of people give him credit. So I feel that Xenos isn't an S-tier villain in my eyes, but he is much stronger than a lot of people give him credit for. I am happy to put him in A-tier, and I think that his presentation both in Stormblind and Endwalker kind of exemplifies that. There's a reason that Xenos is the final kind of encounters that you have rather than Meteon in Endwalker, and I think that that's because he has represented like everything the Warrior of Light has done up until that point, as I say, as a mirror being held up to the player and going, this is you. So I like the way he's presented, and I think he's actually a lot stronger than people think he is. But let's be honest, and this is the one character I've allowed myself to put on this list that's not normally represented by Square Enix and other media, but Xenos doesn't hold a candle to Emet-Selch, and we all know it. There are entire essays written about Emet-Selch within the Final Fantasy fandom and even within video games as a whole, certainly the MMO sphere, because of just how likable, charismatic, well-written, well-executed this character is. Emet-Selch is arguably, possibly not even inarguably, the best villain that Final Fantasy's ever had. The fact that you have swaths of people declaring that Emet-Selch was never really a villain at all and that he was acting on his own ambitions and motivations to try to save his people, I understand why people say that, but I do question that a little bit. Like, you know, whether you like to claim his motivations were sound or not, Solus / Emet-Selch does commit genocide and does so without a second thought. So I don't want to go on too much about Emet-Selch because that in and of itself is going to cause a war in comments and all sorts of things. But I think to say that Emet-Selch isn't deserving of S tier as being the best Final Fantasy villain ever written would be criminal. And I know he's not what Square Enix normally puts as the representation for FF14, but could you imagine if I didn't put him in this list? Do you imagine the comments I would have gotten if I didn't mention Emet-Selch? Now for another underrated villain in the Final Fantasy pantheon, and I think that mantle definitely sits right with Ardyn from Final Fantasy 15. Ardyn kinda combines the best parts of Kefka with some of the best parts of Emet-Selch in that Ardyn technically does win. You know, when Noctis goes into the crystal towards the end of Final Fantasy 15, Ardyn does plunge the world into darkness, but that's only if you consider that winning for Ardyn, because Ardyn's real kind of goal is to die, and it's because of his sympathetic nature, which I again would draw similar comparisons to somebody like Emet-Selch, that you kind of want that to happen for him. He's a very sympathetic character that does some very bad things. My issue with Ardyn is much the same as it was with Noctis. Final Fantasy 15 actually has a really well-crafted world around it, and it's very intriguing the ways in which the characters interact. So, for example, the fact that Ardyn does actually take out one of the main characters in Luna Freya is a big deal, and it presents one of the more evocative scenes in the game. But it's not until you see the DLC that you get to see what Ardyn's really about, and I don't really love the idea that you have to pay to see more of a character, certainly not someone as pivotal as the main villain of the game. But when you do look at episode Ardyn, you see quite how rough Ardyn's had it from day dot. Like, literally thousands of years of torment and being mocked by the people around him, the gods of the world, the actual world itself with the Star Scourge, and the fact that he's actually just trying to help people, and yet every turn he takes is just a brand new day of getting spat on by fate. The poor sod's been through it, so it's no wonder he's angry. I think Arden's another great one. I think that there is some further potential that could have been had with Arden, especially if we'd gotten the book come through or any of the rest of the DLC that was planned for Final Fantasy 15. It would have been nice to have seen that full story, certainly relating to Bahamut, who basically put Arden where he was. But Arden is another villain that technically wins both in both ways that he wants to. Obviously, he does kind of get taken out by the end of the game, and he does technically plunge the world into darkness, so there is a lot to be said for Arden's characterization and the way he presents himself within the game. I also think he's a pretty badass character to look at, which is always a plus, so I'd put him quite firmly in A tier. Which brings us to our final villain of today's video, which is going to be Ultima from Final Fantasy 16. I'm gonna be real with you, when I first saw Ultima, like about halfway through Final Fantasy 16, I was really intrigued. I thought the design was really different and kind of creepy and interesting. But as the game goes on, I'm pretty sure he's one of the weaker villains that Final Fantasy's had. I think it doesn't help Ultima's case that within the first 10 minutes of Final Fantasy 16, you find a character who is very easily classed as a villain that evokes a much stronger, like, emotional response than Ultima does, which is Duchess Annabella Rosfield. Because let's face it, anyone who played Final Fantasy 16 even a little bit hated this woman the second they saw her. And so when you have a character like Ultima that just kind of turns up seemingly out of nowhere and waxes lyrical about how he's better than everybody else and basically just acts a bit wound up that his creations are a little bit more content than he is, he kind of just falls flat. I can't help but feel like Ultima is trying to tug on the same ball of yarn that Emet-Selch is trying to do. After all, he's wanting to reawaken his race, he wants to return home, he wants to drain the planet of its energy. He's trying to do very similar things, and yet none of it has the same emotional impact, because Ultima is hardly relatable in any way, shape or form, because he spends most of his time on screen explaining why he's not relatable, which again makes it difficult to connect to him. He's just not a particularly interesting character, and especially when you have so many more fleshed out characters within Final Fantasy 16 than him. I liked Final Fantasy 16's plot from the beginning because, much like Final Fantasy Tactics, it's a very human told story. You know, you hated Annabella when you saw her because she was really mean to Clive and, you know, favored Joshua, did all of this thing, threw Clive to one side. You really felt for him at that point. And Ultima just being whatever to kind of everything just ruins that a little bit. So while I wouldn't say he's as weak as Barthandelus or Cloud of Darkness, I would kind of put him on the same level as Emperor, and I don't know, maybe people feel differently to me on that one. So there is my villains tier list for Final Fantasy antagonists, but before we end the video, I want to get you guys involved with future videos like this, and so for today's video, I've asked my wonderful supporters on Patreon to post their own tier lists so that we can react and analyze them together and showcase that these things really are subjective. I'm in the process of reforming my Patreon into doing more things like this, so if you would like to be involved, the link is in the description box below, and there will be many more benefits to come. And to those of you who have stuck with me, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. Truly, it really does mean a lot. So let's have a look at some of yours. So our first list here comes from one of my patrons, Lady Janessa, who looks very similar to mine, actually. The only differences I can really see there are that Arden is popped up into S tier, while Kuja is down in A tier. And other than that, it actually looks pretty much the same. Oh, and Golbez is down in C tier as well. So just to have a look at what they've said about it, Emet-Selch is one of the best villains. Kefka and Sephiroth are as iconic as they are. Arden, I think, is a good character screwed by how segmented FF15's story is with different media. Xenos, Vayne, Jecht, and Kuja are all solid. Garland, Ultimisia, and Kalnot are just kind of okay. Remake Sephiroth is still an icon, but an icon they missed the point on, which is exactly what I've said, actually. Golbez, Emperor Ecgtheow could have been more than what they were. Cod and Barthandelus, meh. I mean, I can see the argument for Arden being in S tier. I think that he is very beloved. People forget how popular Final Fantasy 15 actually is, and I think that Arden was a big part of that. So honestly, I'm here for it. So this next list comes courtesy of Pale Raider 13, and I can already see some choices here, I could say that much. But the S tier, having Vayne in S tier is interesting. I like that people do understand that Vayne is a very intriguing character, to say the least. Arden again in S tier, Ultimisia upper tier in A, Garland upper tier in A, Golbez, Cloud of Darkness and Emperor in B tier is certainly a choice. Cloud and Darkness and Emperor above Kefka, that one I might have a few issues with. And then Sephiroth, remake Sephiroth all the way down in D tier, and Exdeath being so much lower than Cloud of Darkness, I find very interesting. So taking a look at their comments, so in S tier they've said, these villains are exceptionally well written, they're the puppeteers of their respective arcs and games, they're complex, they're intelligent, they're enigmatic and more than worthy of respect. Atmosphere changes in the room when they set foot in it. I would argue that's not true for Vayne. I'd say Vayne is as much a puppet as he is a puppeteer, but other than that, I can agree with that. A tier not as heavy hitting as the above, but these villains are still intimidating in their own right. Manipulators, and these villains still have consistent and satisfying development. I find that interesting in the case of Garland, because I think that Garland has to have external media in order to enjoy that with like Stranger of Paradise, and they have said that they are taking into account all of their appearances across the franchise, so including Dissidia, etc., whereas I tried to kind of avoid that a little bit. B tier, these villains are fine, but nothing to write home about. COD is more of a force of nature than anything, so can't really build a personality there. I question then why they're in B tier. If they've got nothing, then how you have that? I'm not over you having this over Kefka. I'm sorry. But each to their own. These characters may be good villains by definition in C tier, but they're pretty petty and shallow. Ultima got mad that his own creation started being happier than him. Camlanort was jarringly anticlimactic, and Kefka just wants to destroy because haha funny. Okay, I think that the point has been missed with Kefka here. Again, I'm going to use the Alice in Wonderland analogy here. Some things don't have to be explained, and that's what makes them scary. Imagine if the Joker from DC, in DC's Batman, had an actual origin story. It would kill the character instantly. And I'd argue that over-explanation is what killed Sephiroth a little bit. D tier, zero direction, zero sense. I'm intrigued as to how you put Sephiroth that far down. Like, I definitely think he's been sullied by remake, but I don't know about D tier. That's a choice. But hey, like I said, this whole point is to create discussion and us like bond over similar subject matter, even if we don't necessarily agree on things. Then the last viewer tier list I'm going to have today here comes courtesy of Cobalt Zork, who's been a supporter of mine for a very long time, as have the others, so thank you so much for that. In S tier, we just have Arden and Vayne. I feel like these more sort of like ground level. Actually, that's not true for Arden at all. He's not ground level villain. He's not political, really. I mean, he is. He plays the political game, but he's got so much more going for him than just that. And I think the tragedy of Arden's story resonates with a lot of people. Everyone but me's put him in S tier, which is really interesting. And then you have Kuja, Sephiroth, and Kefka in A tier. I'd say that's fair. By the way, Cobalt has told me in advance that they haven't played either of the MMOs, so no Camlanort, Xenos, or Emet-Selch here. Then remake Sephiroth in B tier, Emperor, Golbez, and Garland. Jecht all the way down in C tier. And Ultimisia, like that's really interesting. As well as Exdeath. I would not put Jecht in the same tier as Exdeath. I'm sorry, but like I can't get on board with that. And then Cloud of Darkness and Bartandalus in D tier. I think everyone's pretty well established that Bartandalus is just a heck of a nothing burger, and that's fine. Although Cobalt has said, I put Jecht low because he's not really the villain, though Square Enix like to paint him as it. And we had kind of a discussion about, like, I feel that his role as an antagonist and his role as a villain are very different things. But, like, while we came to an agreement on it, they decided to keep him in C tier. But I don't know about putting him in the same tier as Exdeath. I mean, that's fine. But other than that, like, I respect the Arden love a great deal. And I wasn't expecting people to love Vayne as much as they do. So that's it for today's video. It's a long one. Like, I kind of envisioned that this one would be a long one. I'm very much somebody that's attuned with villains and storytelling more than I am with the heroes, largely speaking. My favorite villain has always been Kuja and Kefka, and then Emet-Selch obviously has come around and kind of swept everybody off their feet a little bit, I'm sure. But I'd love to hear from you. Who are your favorite villains in the Final Fantasy franchise? The next few tier list style videos I'm going to do probably won't be Final Fantasy oriented. So I'd be keen to hear in the comments what other franchises you'd like to hear from me with regards to tier listing, whether it's the games themselves, boss fights, for characters. I'd love to hear your ideas because this is a new direction for me and I'm really quite enjoying exploring this angle, so I'd love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this video or any others that I've made, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel because every little bit of support makes all the difference in the world, every single one. So thank you very much to those of you who do. And if you'd like to join in with the videos, like I've said with the tier list that have been posted by viewers, etc., my Patreon is linked down below, but just be aware that it is being reformed quite heavily at the moment, so do bear that in mind, and thank you for your patience. But until then, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let you guys get on with your day. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.